Welcome to the 10th edition of La Cocina's Voices from the Kitchen. Today we'll be exploring choice through the lens of food from voices that are often left out of popular dialogue. At La Cocina, we are dedicated to supporting talented women of color chefs who've made the choice to turn their talents into gold, food gold. That choice is a powerful act of freedom, of self-determination. And over the 8 years that I've worked at La Cocina, I've seen over and over again how unequal the choices we are posed with, and how many decisions we make that just aren't the same. And then the pandemic came and made that all the more real. While I was at home wondering, should I get rid of pants forever? Fernay McPherson, owner of Minnie Bell's Soul Movement, and maker of the best fried chicken, if you don't believe me, you can ask Draymond Green's mom, was grappling with an entirely different set of decisions.
I wanted to shelter in place, but 3 weeks in, no revenue coming through, I knew I had to make a decision. It was scary. We knew little about the virus. People were dying. We didn't even have to wear masks. But I decided to open if I wanted Minnie Bell's to survive, and in the process, staying prayed up.
Fernay, and of all of the really intense decisions you've had to make since this pandemic started, what's been the most important?
I realized how much energy I put into everything else, being mom, being business owner. I did not give myself energy. So I have decided to put energy back into me. And in doing that, that means drinking wine every day at lunch.
Wine at lunch? That is a pandemic decision that I can get behind. But tell me, Fernay, how do you feel about pants?
Totally overrated.
Thank you. That's what I think. Friends, I could talk to you about pants and wine all night, but we're just the warm-up. So grab your favorite beverage.
And get ready for 9 amazing stories. You'll even get to see me again.
Cheers.
Cheers.
One of my favorite shows that I've been watching with dedication during the pandemic has been this really awesome Korean cooking competition called, depending on which streaming service you use, either Chef in My Fridge or Please Take Care of My Refrigerator. The central conceit of the show is amusing. 2 celebrities bring their actual refrigerators down to a TV studio where 8 chefs face off one-on-one using ingredients from those refrigerators. The chefs rotate week to week, but one of the more interesting chefs is Mikhail Ashminov. He's a white Bulgarian chef, master chef at the celebrated Zelen restaurant in Seoul. And he speaks really good Korean, I mean definitely better than my own. On the show, Mikhail tends to make Eastern European food. And as someone who is biracial, specifically Korean and Polish, it was always interesting watching him try to work Korean ingredients with Eastern European food. In one episode, Mikhail decides to make Pidogi. Though broadly eaten across Central and Eastern Europe, in the popular imagination, Pidogi is almost exclusively linked to Polish cuisine. So integral was it to my mom's own Polish roots that it was an essential dish at every large family gathering. And to this day, eating them brings me back powerfully to days gone by in my youth. As Mikhail begins to prepare, the host asks him to explain, what is this dish? He thinks about it for a second, and then he says, Polish mandu. In that moment, the hosts and the chefs, they all look at each other and they nod and say, oh, Polish mandu, Polish mandu. Mandu being the Korean word for dumpling. In that moment, I was struck by this description, which was both totally logical and also felt somehow absurd. I was struck by something else, though. I sat up and it hit me. I'm a Polish mandu. I couldn't stop thinking about this in the days that passed, texting friends and relatives with my newfound realization. All these years, looking for a way to describe myself besides biracial or multiracial. And now here it was, plain as day. Polish mandu. Bewitched and inspired to decide, you know what, I'm going to make Pidogi. Dumplings are everywhere culturally. If you squint hard enough, even a ravioli qualifies. I think the act of pleating dough around a filling is universal in some ways. And though Pidogi and mandu share half-oval shapes, the pleating on a Pidogi is a little bit more elaborate. The dumplings themselves are a little bit more billowy compared to the flatter, meatier mandu. However, despite a lifetime of mandu making, I had never once made a Pidogi. And the fact that I had never even really tried to make Polish food is something that had really vexed my mother, who cooks both excellent Korean and Polish food. Now is my time, though. I had never made my own dough for mandu before, since it's so easily and readily available at Asian grocery stores. But this day I was gonna make my own dough for the Pidogi. And after that, when I finally sat down to fill them, specifically with potato, cheese, and onion, just like the Pidogi of my youth, my hands, they just intuitively knew how to fold it. Kind of like the hundreds of mandu they had folded before. Something about the muscle memory and craftsmanship of those folds and pleats that was still there. And I was actually taken back to moments that I sat with my halmoni, my Korean grandmother in my youth, making dumplings all morning. I had never made Pidogi with my white grandmother. I felt a longing for it. She's 90 years old though, and she lives 6 hours away from me. And there's a pandemic, so I couldn't really get to her. The Pidogi, anyway, they were delicious. I was really proud of them. But while eating them, something else began to creep into my brain. The filling of the Pidogi was great, as was the dough. A voice, though, in the back of my brain began whispering to me. And then soon there it was. What if you're not a Polish mandu? What if instead you're a Korean Pidogi? Forgive me if that metaphor is too on the nose, but bear with me just a little bit. A Korean Pidogi, as I began to think about it now, would be a Polish filling wrapped with a mandu dough. I'm soft on the outside and I'm garlicky on the inside, but I also present more East Asian in my phenotype, aside from, I guess, the very hairy legs that folks like to attribute to my white genes. No, I'm clearly more Korean or Asian looking on the outside, and being raised by a single white mother after my father died in my youth has meant I lean more culturally American, more culturally white. Internally, I've never felt Korean enough. And a lot of my adult life's journey has been working towards assuring myself that my outer skin matches more with my internal feelings. My wrapping, my face, all of that looks more Korean, or like a mandu to the naked eye. But inside, I'm more of a Pidogi. Really though, as with all things, it's probably more nebulous. All the things that make up my filling and my wrapper, these change depending on time and place. And whether you think about it as a Korean Pidogi or a Polish mandu, one thing is always ultimately true of dumplings. They're delicious.
One of the most distinctive shared food experiences for Filipino Americans of my generation is growing up regularly snacking on canned meat. Could be Spam, could be corned beef, could be Vienna sausages, but no matter what, it comes out of that pantry and onto a bowl of rice cooker rice. I found myself talking about Vienna sausages, arguably the most harrowing of all of the canned meat experiences, with Eileen Suzara, one of the La Cocina entrepreneurs, whose food business is called Sariwa, the word for fresh in Tagalog.
I just have very visceral memories of like the jelly, the amniotic fluid that the Vienna sausages seem to live inside of.
And like the smell, the specific smell of the Vienna sausages, like getting dumped on rice, like.
It's so specific. Or like, I think now if I met a Vienna sausage for the first time, it's like, why would we eat this?
But we ate Vienna sausages because of our cultural history. Because a century ago, wealthy American colonists in the Philippines ate canned meat, and Filipinos later claimed the habit for themselves and passed it on.
I think my parents really came from a generation that was so hell-bent on like all things American or a lot of assimilation food.
We talked about the sense of loss we both felt about not learning Tagalog when we were little, and the understanding at the same time that our parents had been taught by a colonial system to deprioritize their native language.
I think that we're fortunate to be able to like mother into this time when now, there are less barriers to passing things along. And I think I started to realize, like, okay, like, even if relearning or recovering certain practices is imperfect, like, you go with the imperfect because this is what we have.
We were talking about mothering because Eileen's daughter Isla, napping while we Zoom called, had just reached a particular milestone. At 9 months, she'd spent as much time in the world as she'd spent in Eileen's body. As for me, I was about 7 weeks away from delivering my own baby. Lineage had been on my mind. I'd realized that if I didn't make the active choice to teach my kid about Filipino culture, they might never learn. They wouldn't grow up eating lumpia and pancit and roasted pig at family parties, in part because I live so far away from my family. Because I, like my parents, have embraced dislocation in pursuit of freedom. Because my life is marked by the loss and the gain of immigrating into new things. Eileen moved around a lot growing up. She was born in Washington State, lived in Florida, lived in Houston, spent some time in the Mojave Desert in California. Like me, she'd eaten Filipino party food growing up. But when she was 8 years old or so, she discovered an old Filipino cookbook in her house, written in English, which felt to a somewhat isolated kid who loved fantasy books like a magic portal. The cookbook held recipes with coconut milk, long beans, okra, a new side to her culinary heritage. Soon after, she visited the Philippines with her family, and then they moved to Hawaii, where for the first time, she experienced living in a brown majority population. The inner conflict that Eileen had felt, that I still wrestle with, about the entanglement of Filipino identity, our names, our DNA with colonialism, shifted when she was among Native Hawaiian people who were working to claim and recover their traditions, their language, their food, their sovereignty. Eileen started thinking about how to merge her interests in food, land, and preservation. She spent several years farming, which she was aware was not the vision many immigrant parents have for their children.
They are protective. Growing food was entangled in historic drama. Their sacrifices gave me privilege to choose a healing path in food.
Ultimately, Eileen ended up in the Bay Area where Sariwa came to be. The first Sariwa pop-up was at a fundraiser in the wake of Typhoon Haiyan. Eileen made kabocha squash and coconut milk, greens, biko, adobo. Since then, through Sariwa, Eileen has pulled forward a more sustainable complexity in the Filipino food tradition, showing that Filipino food doesn't have to be a huge pile of rice and salt and sugar and garlic and meat, as wonderful as we both agreed as those piles are, to also be a source of comfort, a connection to home.
And I feel like, I would sometimes just have conversations with Filipino Americans or maybe other folks who work in the community from a health setting. And there would just kind of be this like rueful, like, oh, all Filipino food is bad for you. Or the doctor told me I just have to stop eating Filipino food. And that's heartbreaking.
As she pointed out, every culture, after all, has party food, indulgent food, as well as everyday foods that can help keep you well. As Sariwa developed, Eileen wanted to really see what it meant to be mission-driven, to source from farmers of color, to truly operate in the interest of a collective. Getting pregnant solidified her choice to try something different. Even though she felt sometimes like she was failing to live up to a shinier vision of finding a space and opening a restaurant. So after giving birth, she looked for opportunities to get involved feeding postpartum families. During the pandemic, she made prepared meals for Asian health services, made produce boxes in collaboration with local farmers. These choices felt small but intentional and fitting for a moment when everything is in flux. The last question I asked was about Isla, whose first food was purple sweet potato. What kind of food memories, what kind of relationship to nourishment did Eileen want to pass on?
I just want her to celebrate all of it. And I think just knowing that my hope is for her to have so many paths back to understanding who she is. I just want her to see herself reflected everywhere. To be able to taste like Filipino foods and Indian foods and know that they're both their own, and to also eat all the different foods that are of California, like of people here, her neighbors, her friends. And I really want her to have like an intuitive sense of understanding where her food comes from, like not in like the not in the Michael Pollan way. Sorry, Michael.
Yeah, I was just about to say yeah.
but just really having a deeply grounded sense of.
Eileen added that she wanted Isla to see people of color at the front line of food in this country. That she wanted her daughter to see so many of our old systems being reevaluated, burned down, torn apart. My baby had been kicking me the entire time Eileen and I were speaking, in a way that I took to mean that they agreed.
How does our species respond to a deadly virus capable of so much destruction? Those first few months of COVID, some fled, catching desperate flights to New Zealand or Bali. Marriages crumbled, substance abuse spiked. More than a third of Americans have displayed clinical signs of anxiety or depression or both. Then there was Emma, who discovered the perfect recipe for a rockin' breakfast burrito. Elsewhere in the country, Frances had cracked the code for funnel cake. Gemma chanced upon an easy and delicious banana bread recipe. And Bodie, 8 years old, got his hands on the blueprints for peppermint brownies, albeit with a sober warning. Don't eat too much brownie or you'll get diarrhea. I know this because starting that first week of shelter in place back in March, I began publishing 6 Feet of Separation, a free newspaper by and for young people trying to make sense of their insane new world. Over the last 7 months, I've published hundreds of articles by children and teens all over the country and beyond. A pandemic is massively disempowering, even for adults, and I wanted to give young people a tiny sliver of agency, plus a way to feel part of something at a time when they were otherwise pretty isolated. On top of that, encouraging a new generation of journalists and critical thinkers, particularly in underserved communities, seemed like a good idea right about now. Those are the reasons I say out loud. But I had a smaller, more selfish interest in starting this paper too. At a basic level, I was dying to know what was going on in young people's heads. Suddenly millions of kids are living under the shadow of serious illness, living with social deprivation, with horrific economic uncertainty. They're living with things I don't even know how to name. What does it mean to see in the space of half a year the adults of the world become habituated to death? What does that do to kids? There was a time when this country fretted extravagantly over far less. Remember when Teen Talk Barbie said math is hard and that was the worst thing that had ever happened to children? Okay, now that I mention it, the Barbie thing does make me mad all over again, but you get my point. Anyway, the contributors to 6 Feet of Separation have sure enough used the paper to articulate what's going on inside. There are diary entries about loneliness and poems about anxiety, essays about the connection between coronavirus and Black Lives Matter. But for a subset of young people out there, explicit self-reflection isn't quite their frequency. Their frequency is lemon tarts, or cream biscuits, or peanut butter and banana sandwiches. The number of recipes I've received from budding chefs is staggering, and I publish them all. These, too, are responses to the moment. Sure, guzzling wine and binge-watching Netflix may be the correct way to process feelings, but recipes are legit, too. Lily, who's 7, taught readers how to make energy balls. And in the process, she also wrote about missing her friends and how all that time alone led to a dream of one day opening her own restaurant run entirely by kids. I'm going to use this time at home to keep practicing until I have enough skills, she wrote. Then there was Sanvi, who's 11, reporting from India. The roads are completely empty, she wrote in issue 4. The tailor who mends clothes and sits under the tree has gone. The ironing man has left for his village, and I do not have any friend to play with me. But one day she came across a recipe for potato wedges that spoke to her. They were fried, not baked, and she attempted to convince her mother to cook them. I gathered from Sanvi this was a big deal. Her normal diet consists mostly of sweet lime juice, coconut water, and tea. Sometimes some aubergine, sometimes some okra. This fried potato business was a departure, but she told me she cried crocodile tears, and at last her mother agreed to fry some potato wedges. It was something of a turning point. I don't mean Sanvi's loneliness magically disappeared, or the tailor went back to sitting under the tree, or the ironing man returned. Last we checked in, she was still on lockdown in India. But a small ember had been lit. Sanvi started training her dog to jump over a broom. She began playing board games with her family. And she and her father started having cooking competitions. The winner gets the equivalent of about $6, she told me. There's going to be a day when Sanvi's not a kid anymore. I know you know how childhood works. You turn into an adult. But it's worth underscoring. All this nowness will get folded into who Sanvi becomes, as it will with Emma and Frances and Gemma and Bodhi and Lily and all the other young cooks. They'll be warped just as we've all been warped. You hope it's the happy, resilient kind of warping, but who knows? The big reveal doesn't happen for decades. My grandfather's childhood was marked by the uncertainty and occasional alienation that comes with growing up in an immigrant home. The generation that came next grew up with taciturn dads who'd seen God knows what in World War II. My generation's pendulum swung in a different direction. MTV and divorce and latchkeys and no nukes. And now my kids and 1.9 billion other kids are being shaped by this, whatever this is. People say children are a black box. I've come to think of them as crockpots. We've put an insane collection of bizarre ingredients inside, set a cosmic timer, and in 20 years we get to see how they turn out. I keep waiting for one of the kids to submit that recipe to the newspaper.
I live and bike around San Francisco, but my family wasn't originally from here. In the 1970s, my parents moved north from New Orleans with hopes of opening a series of fast food restaurants on the south side of Chicago in pursuit of their American dream and to serve their community. Those dreams were almost crushed as they got rejection after rejection after rejection trying to secure a small business loan. Had it not been for one token hire at a bank who saw the value in their proposals, they would have never prevailed. Their experience was not unique. Their business journey was compromised by redlining, the systematic exclusion of certain people from government and private sector services. The term is its origins in maps drawn up from surveys by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federally created agency under the New Deal. The purported intent was to make housing investments more secure. The surveyors measured land values in almost 300 cities, including Oakland, San Francisco, and Richmond. They used factors such as terrain, building type, access to transportation, but the primary driver of the grading system was race, income, and infiltration of non-white people and immigrants. Areas that were valuable were colored green, blue was still desirable, yellow for declining, and red for hazardous or not worth investment. In this way, government surveyors mirrored a society that didn't find much value in the people in those neighborhoods and perverted the market, further limiting capital available in the red area and prioritizing the injection of funds into other neighborhoods, as the lives and livelihoods of some were more significant than others. Redlining continues to have an impact today. You see it not only in the conditions in certain neighborhoods, through underfunding of city parks and schools and the lack of food markets, but also the inability to get a loan to start or expand a restaurant meant to serve those communities. Today, La Cocina entrepreneurs don't just exist, but thrive within the system of discrimination. Every day, we all vote with our consumer dollars, giving us the ability to support these entrepreneurs as their existence represents a more just system.
Esther Ng's career in Hollywood began the same way so many careers in Hollywood do. She changed her name. The folks in San Francisco's Chinatown, where she was born in 1914, didn't have much trouble with it. But that last name of hers gave white people a pretty hard time. N and G, two consonants together, they couldn't make sense of it. So she made the decision to add an E to that last name of hers, elongating it to Ng. Esther Ng. In the late 1930s, Esther auditioned for a role in The Good Earth. It was a film adaptation of Pearl S. Buck's novel about two Chinese farmers. MGM had already cast white actors to play the leads. The only substantive role for a Chinese actor was for Lotus, a concubine. Who knows if Esther would have gotten the role? Life had other plans. Before she could find out, a friend asked her to co-produce a Hollywood film called Heartaches. She was barely 20. Heartaches jump-started a prolific career behind the camera for Esther. She directed just short of a dozen feature films until her death in 1970. She's been referred to as the first female director of Southern China and the first Chinese woman to direct a Chinese-language film in the United States. Esther didn't just make movies, though. In 1949, she settled in New York, where she opened a spate of popular Chinese restaurants. All of these accomplishments suggest you would know Esther Ng's name, but I won't blame you if you haven't heard of her. You won't find much footage of her films today. Her restaurants have all shuttered. It's odd that Esther has all but vanished from cultural memory. Throughout her life, she made deliberate decisions to be remembered. Consider the way she dressed. Though she was small, she cut a striking figure in her suit jackets and slacks made for men. This was her way of telling the world that she loved women. When I first read Esther's story a few years ago, nothing about it made sense. I saw parts of myself in her. I also love people of the same sex, and I've also got a name that white people can't always really pronounce. Still, she confounded me. I had a naive vision of history back then. I always thought of the past as a dangerous trap for queer people, and I just assumed it'd be that for queer Asian women like Esther. But Esther challenged all of my assumptions. The closet did not ensnare her. How did she live so freely? Maybe it's because she'd always been a dreamer. Movies were her sanctuary. As a teenager, she worked the box office of the Mandarin, a San Francisco theater. She must have seen 1,000 movies there. No wonder she devoted her life to cinema. After Heartache, she struck out on her own. She went to Hong Kong, still a British colony back then, to make feature-length movies. These films were proudly feminist. In 1939, she headed back home to San Francisco, where she directed 1941's Golden Gate Girl. It was the action star Bruce Lee's debut. He played a baby girl. Esther's image generated as much press as her movies. A Chinatown newspaper noted how her sleek, boyish bob is worn with one very slight wave at the left side, which breaks the straightness. Breaks the straightness. Even those words feel like a sly nod to her queerness. A 1946 Seattle Times profile of Esther also fixated on her appearance, her delicately chiseled face, her sensitive mouth, her shiny blue-black hair that was cropped in a mannish bob. Esther always blurred borders, between genders, between languages, between nations. She continued this rebellious streak when she moved to New York in 1949. She opened a restaurant, Bobo, in Manhattan's Chinatown. There she served cellophane-wrapped chicken, winter melon soup, butterfly shrimp with bacon. The restaurant was a favorite of Chinese opera performers stranded in New York. Meanwhile, white American celebrities like Marlon Brando and Tennessee Williams frequented the restaurant too. She opened 4 more restaurants, including 2 bearing her name. They found a champion in Craig Claiborne, the New York Times food editor who, like Esther, was gay. Those restaurants weren't just about the food. People would trek to them just to catch a glimpse of Esther herself. Esther didn't stop making movies. Her final, 1961's Murder in New York Chinatown, is partially set in one of her restaurants, fusing her 2 great loves of food and film. She died young, at 55, in 1970. People may be tempted to say that Esther was a woman ahead of her time. I get the impulse, but it feels wrong. It removes her from the era she inhabited, almost denying that she even existed when she did. Esther lived in bold strokes. So why has she become a ghost? Maybe others gazed at her the same way I initially did, with confusion. Esther didn't follow the rules of what the past looked like. That America has forgotten her feels like a choice too. A choice to ignore the voices who disrupt our tidy narratives of the past. But Esther has been lurking on the fringes of cultural memory, waiting for you to discover her. A Google search for Esther Ng restaurant still yields the address 18 Pell Street, even though the restaurant's been closed for decades. And you can spot her name on the back of the 12-inch single of Madonna's debut song, Everybody. The scene in that photo is totally chaotic. Buildings lean to the side as if they might just tip over. Most of their facades are nondescript. But the name of Esther Ng's restaurant cuts through the chaos. Even in death, Esther Ng knew how to stand out in a crowd.
Whom do you envy? That's a question to ask yourself when you don't know what you want to do with your life or you're looking for a compass, because it tells you what's important to you, even if you don't consciously realize it. And it's a question that I ask people when they're, graduating from college, or they're going through a quarter life or midlife crisis, or, they're even debating whether or not to be a stay-at-home parent. many years ago, I actually was dating a very nerdy guy in Silicon Valley. In fact, so nerdy that he was officially called adorkable by the media. And one night we were falling asleep and I asked him, "So who do you envy?" And I don't know what I was expecting him to say, but it definitely wasn't this, which is he said, "I envy my friends who are happily married." And I remember thinking like, oh, we are very different people, because I knew at that time that I envied people who had impact on the world, whether it's through like really interesting new ideas, like the Nobel Prize winning economist Daniel Kahneman, or, you know, creating life-saving nonprofits like Paul Farmer, or creating impact, you know, these kind of global impact type startups like Google, or having like historical discoveries like Marie Curie. So in short, he envied people who had New York Times winning announcements, and I envied people who had New York Times obituaries. And I kind of understand, because at that point in his life, he'd already impacted billions of people. In fact, anyone who's watching this video probably uses some of the product of his work. So that's not necessarily what he craved, to have impact. In fact, one of the first dinners we had, we talked about our lives, and he mentioned that once he threw a birthday party for himself and no one came, which I found heart-wrenching. Because, you know, I can throw dinner parties on a couple of hours notice and 12 to 15 people will show up. Maybe I've never looked to marriage or to companionship to fill a void, because as they say, to one person, you're the world, but to the world, you're just one person. And I think I might be fine being just one person to the world, as long as it's one person that matters. I asked, one of my friends who is a Harvard Medical School professor and a mother of two, who she envied, and she told me she envied people who are travel writers. And in another case, I have a diplomat friend who has served in Sudan and Iraq, and also worked at the United Nations. And the people he envied were like novelists who sat at their desks all day and looked at their backyard and just typed. And one of our, Silicon Valley CEO type friends went to Burning Man and realized he envied the people who had the right to be happy, and went home and actually got divorced, which is very startling. So, and one of the most interesting examples was one friend who had gotten to Stanford undergrad, had gone to business school, had worked at McKinsey, and the people she envied were friends who ran a small shop that sold baby goods. And that was so surprising to me. I finally kind of understood, which is in many cases, these jobs, whether or not it's on Wall Street or it's in big law firms or these big tech companies, create fancy things, but you kind of just feel like a cog in a big machine. So to feel any part of ownership through a giant project sometimes is really hard. But the thing about that small shop was basically it lives or dies basically on what you do. There is no one else sort of to catch you when you fall. So that what exists is through the sweat and tears of your own efforts. So a long time ago, I was a New York Times reporter, and I wrote a book on Chinese food that was a bestseller. And so people ask me these days, why are you going to write again? Because it's been about a decade since I've really written anything. And when I think about it, I say, I think I'll write when I have something interesting to say that's not already being said. But, we do other things. Like right now, I also regulate emoji. I help bring emoji into the world through an organization called Emoji Nation, whose motto is emoji by the people, for the people. And it basically fights for more representative and, inclusive emoji, including the hijab emoji. We did the interracial couple emoji. And part of it is, you get that immense satisfaction of impacting billions and billions of people. I mean, it's a little tiny bit per person because it's just what's on their emoji keyboard. The other thing that I do now and many times is I help a lot of artists and creators and filmmakers or animators and musicians with their projects. And someone asked, why do you spend so much time doing this? I was like, you know what? Because at that point in someone's career, they just have their creativity and their work. And you can have an impact simply by believing in it. So in that case, you're not impacting billions of people or like millions of people or even thousands of people. You're, impacting one person, but kind of like you matter in the world to this one person. So that boyfriend was an amazing guy. We ended up breaking up, maybe not surprisingly, but when he broke up, he gave me a list of 5 reasons. The 5th reason was actually I didn't laugh at his jokes. So if I have one piece of advice for women or guys out there, when in doubt, always laugh at the guy's jokes. A few years ago, he got married, and then they had the first kid, the first of what is eventually 3. And I went and I visited, and I held the baby, in my arms, and tried to feel if I had a sense of envy, and I didn't, which was strange, I guess. And I don't know if I wanted to or didn't want to feel a sense of envy when, held the baby. But, and I have so much joy whenever I see their family portraits, which they get regularly done, with all the kids and their various kind of quirkinesses, because I know that he has found the happiness that he has sought for a long time. And in many ways, I have, found my own version of happiness, just on a different path.
I haven't had a latte since March 12th. I'm not complaining, merely stating a fact of my coronavirus life. Pre-pandemic, I purchased one every day. Most mornings, it was at Cole Valley's wooden coffee house. I sit in a window seat, earning my keep in cold LaCroix, talking with the owner, Steve Wickwire, about his squawking parakeet in the corner, or complimenting Yvette Martinez on her latest t-shirt, as she handed me a ceramic cup brimming with a leaf-shaped swirl before I could even order. A latte in San Francisco costs $6 or so, including tip, and you have to tip. For fun, one day, my 5th grader calculated that I had been spending $2,184 a year on coffee. Appalling, yes, but that's also $2,184 cafes are collectively losing from me alone. I've been making coffee at home. I've also been cooking at home, morning, noon, and night, 7 days a week for my family of 4. Much of my San Francisco life, like much of San Francisco life itself, had revolved around restaurants until they were whisked away faster than an empty cocktail glass at Cafe Fico. I wasn't so much a regular at any particular restaurant as I was a regular of restaurants. Still, I had my go-tos, and from writing a column for the San Francisco Chronicle about restaurant regulars, I know for many people, myself included, a restaurant is more than just a source of food. Since Nopa opened on Divisadero Street in 2006, George McCalman, my co-regular on the regulars column, and I have laughed and cried and closed it down like it's our living room. Hovering for a seat at the bar at Nopa is an Olympic sport. I've met a couple of boyfriends sitting at that bar, says George. I've been spoiled for the experience. How can takeout compare? In those first weeks, bombarded by GoFundMe and Instagram pleas, choosing who to financially support felt overwhelming. Like facing a desert filled with friends who were already dehydrated and now lost without a compass. Almost 7 months later, with businesses desperately propping up parklets and slinging pizza kits, it still does. As restaurant regulars, who do we save first? Can we even save anyone? A lot of diners are trying to, making donations and picking up picnic packs and pimping their posts. Recently, instead of making my 163rd lunch in a row, I decided to grab sandwiches, like the old days. Standing inside the small space waiting for my order, I almost had a panic attack. There were too many customers, too close for comfort. 2 of them chortling 2 inches from me, noses exposed over their masks. It's not a busy counterstaff's responsibility to police its customers. Then again, a small business, no matter how beloved, can't expect unconditional support from its COVID-conscious customers if they don't. Still, most restaurants are following the rules, working their butts off and doing their best. In turn, some diners are doubling down and ordering out with intention. Amy Dumas, a retired wrestler and vegan, considers takeout as a way to help San Francisco. I don't want to see the city become a shell of what it was, she says. Currently, cravings aren't what dictate dinner in her house. It's where do we want our dollars to go? Who are we going to support tonight? She skips the delivery apps with fees that cut deep into a restaurant's bottom line, and instead zips around on her Vespa, picking up dumplings from Golden Era in the Tenderloin, mushroom skewers from her friends at the Kebabery across the Bay Bridge. It gets me out of my bubble and makes me feel connected to the community, she says. Living in a city is about contributing to your surroundings, smiling at your neighbor, ordering curry. Sarah Amanda Swigert, who teaches writing at City College, spent $300 on meatloaf and mac and cheese at the Mission's long-running Blue Plate one night because of a special that gave all profits to furloughed employees. In the absence of an economic system that takes care of people, it's up to those of us who still have a salary to support, she says. Not all the kinship of being a regular has been lost to the coronavirus. For years, Kim Caldwell and her daughter would get cute and go to Flava's Jamaican Grill once a week. In this moment, it feels especially imperative, she says, to support Black-owned restaurants. Since COVID, just picking up ackee and saltfish on a Saturday night feels like a celebration. I'll run into people and say, hey, I saw you last week, she says, and we'll nod like, we're not cooking. It feels like a night out, but in. To me, cooking is what feels most right now, and yet it also feels wrong. I feel both guilty for not supporting the industry I care so much about, and good for not contributing to the endangerment of the industry and its people I care so much about. In an effort to limit interactions, as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention advises, I can count on about two hands how many times I've ordered takeout since the lockdown. As for eating out, outside or inside a plastic dome designed to separate the city's haves from the have-nots, not once. But if COVID and wildfires have taught us anything, it's that nothing is permanent. Not our 1,000-year-old redwoods, not our 100-year-old restaurants, and certainly not us. I know my occasional takeout won't save the day. Still, the other night, I ordered one roast chicken for $2 for $4, and a Caesar salad from Zuni Cafe. My family and I sat around our kitchen table, again. Without the copper bar and expert bussers and Bob at the piano and the only worthwhile white tablecloths left in this world, it wasn't the same, not even close. But it was still Zuni. I felt a hint of hope. Maybe together, it's the regulars who will see this through.
Let's start with the black mass of me. Eating two 50-cent bags of puffy Cheetos on a grown-up gray couch, binge watching Intervention hour after hour after hour. That wouldn't be the beginning. The beginning would be me awake, wide, empty house, coffee on the perk, mid-ritual weed roll before I've had any breakfast. Everyone notices I am noticeably bigger. Bulking up, my favorite grandfather says, drunk and unaware of how his soothsaying, while true, is also painful. I get my own heavy truth tongue from him. My husband doesn't say everything he thinks. He is not the addict. I am, though it runs river messy through both of our families. We're thinking about having a baby. We're making plans to get pregnant. In the kitchen, after an argument over who ate more of the pizza, my husband, whose feelings I trust more than my own, sits alone and wonders where I am. I am in our bed, broken from hard sex, crying my eyes puffy and thinking like an alcoholic. I haven't smoked weed in X number of days, where X equals a cheap and petty sobriety, where sobriety means 2 puffs doesn't really count, where I did and did not start recounting after that, where recounting would require honesty, where honesty would require that I also not drink, where not drinking and not smoking is just not an option. I am in the bedroom counting alcoholics in my family. I cannot name them. I cannot break their anonymity. Let's just say I take after them completely in skin and nose, in thigh and regret. Every empty bag of 50-cent Cheetos is tucked deep in the garbage can under apple cores and carrot shavings. Only the guilty hide their evidence. For a living, I encourage people to speak public their demon truths. Oh, what a lush lie I live. Speaking doesn't work, or if it does, how would I know? I haven't said a true word in years. My therapist yawned for the first 4 weeks that we met. I am a boring repeat tragedy of my own making. The bartender draws a picture of a pizza cut into 6 equal slices, mumbles, "You're so mad, you're so mad," pointing and laughing at me. But I don't feel mad, I feel hungry. How many ibuprofen do you have to eat before you feel full enough to sink into an ocean? A bathtub's worth, I suppose. On the 8th day, God took a shower and said, maybe today is the day I walk out the door and into this wide world of my own design. Let's call the 9th day Tuesday. Let's say Tuesday is an opportunity, an open calendar, an empty inbox, all potential and ability. Let's say Cheetos are 2 for $1 and you have $1 and a remote and a well-sat couch calling out your name like a lover. Even if you made the wind and the water, the trees and the grass, knowing what you could do, would you still go outside? My favorite documentary is about anorexics and bulimics who need coaches and therapists to help them eat cupcakes, who kill themselves at the end of all this. I admire their sadness, the dedication of it. I'm too hungry to die. We are in the kitchen arguing over who's more patronizing, the boy who knows a pizza can be cut into 6 equal slices, or the girl who needs to know that her 3 slices were still less than half. There is a draft for women in the US now. I can't tell if I feel more confident or condescended. Oh, silly politic. I'm so drunk and hungry, I could eat a bomb.
As an out queer Latina of Nicaraguan heritage, I know the power of choice. I know the power of my voice.
This upcoming election may be the most important one yet. This nation is founded on immigration, but is under stress.
And now it's time to make a strong choice.
From an immigrant and a mother's point of view, I strongly believe that we have a choice to vote.
So I urge everyone out there within the community, and not only just for me, but for everyone around you, your friends, your family, to really go out there and vote, because your voice matters.
If you can vote this November, please do so. And voice for those who are voiceless.
I choose to vote my progressive, feminist, out loud and proud values. Our voice is our vote, and our vote is our voice.
Can you say vote? Vote. 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 Vote.
Whoa!
Vote.
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 Hi, I'm Consuelo Reyes-Lopez, Communications Associate at La Cocina. First, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your evening to watch these beautiful stories, and for some of you, enjoying delicious meals prepared by La Cocina chefs. On behalf of our entire team, we are so grateful for your support. We hope these stories brought a little bit of comfort and joy to your evening. For those of you who are not familiar with La Cocina, we are a nonprofit kitchen incubator working to solve problems of equity and business ownership for women, people of color, and immigrants. Over the past 8 months, our community has been fighting to survive. For 56% of La Cocina entrepreneurs, their business is their family's sole source of income. By the end of March, 70% of La Cocina-born businesses had lost 100% of their sales, and 90% of businesses had to lay off their entire staff. To support our entrepreneurs, we've been encouraging them to prioritize the health and safety of their business, helping them secure rent abatement, and providing monthly stipends through our emergency relief fund that has distributed over $800,000 to date. The most positive thing that could come from this challenging moment is the kindness and generosity that is so evident in the support that we are building for one another. If you are in a position to financially support our organization and are feeling inspired tonight, I encourage you to become a member of La Cocina. Purchase a gift box for the holidays. Give the gift of our cookbook, We Are La Cocina, Recipes in the Pursuit of the American Dream. Your donations and the sales of these orders go directly to our incubator program and support our ability to provide mentorship, affordable commercial kitchen space, market opportunities, and give us the ability to offer storytelling platforms like this one. The links to support our organization in these 3 ways are in the caption below. We hope you consider supporting the kinds of businesses that will create the kinds of communities we want to live in. We are all going to be better fed and better for it. Thank you and have a good night.